Hello and welcome to the much awaited episode on protein. Last week, we dove into the gut and hormone healing plate, and we outlined the infrastructure for how to build a nourishing meal. And this week, we are starting a series of deep dives into the macronutrients that comprise the specific areas of the plate, starting with today's deep dive into protein. So I hope you all are all as excited as we are to dive into these macronutrients. This is what we get excited about. Really with the goal of creating more confidence in making nourishing food choices and reducing confusion when it comes to how to eat for optimal gut and hormone health. So big picture for today, just pulling a little bit from last week, why is protein important? So as we talked about this last week, protein is queen. We've now dubbed it the queen. And as a quick refresher on the big roles that protein plays in the body and why it deserves really the front row seat as a fourth of our plate at every meal and snack, is that it's involved in hormone and neurotransmitter production, really supportive in nourishing our adrenals, which are where our stress hormones come from, supporting healthy detoxification and the breakdown of both internal and external toxins and waste products, building lean muscle, and also for the production of immunoproteins and specifically supporting a healthy gut immune system. So some pretty important roles protein plays. And we're going to go even deeper than that in today's episode. And Jilly's going to kick it off with really, how do we start to use protein in this protein metabolism idea?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about how proteins are actually broken down and how proteins are metabolized and utilized in the body. If you are really into the kind of science behind this and nerding out with us, buckle up. We're going to dive in and kind of walk you through all the nitty-gritty details. So as you guys have probably gathered by now, your body's ability to actually break down, absorb, and assimilate nutrients from food is equally as important as eating the right foods and getting the right amounts of those foods. So how we digest these foods are really, really important. So let's run through kind of the quick and dirty on protein metabolism. Proteins are broken down into amino acids. And if you remember back to like middle school science class, amino acids are referred to as the building blocks of protein. So proteins that we eat are going to first be denatured in the stomach by stomach acid. This is where protein is essentially unraveled, so it is more accessible for being broken down by protease enzymes, which are enzymes that are produced by the pancreas that actually break down protein more so. So protein is denatured by the stomach acid, and then it's broken down in the small intestine by these protease enzymes. This is where you can kind of think about like scissors cutting up or chewing up the protein into smaller peptides or peptide fragments, and then, being further broken down into free amino acids, these building blocks. And ultimately, these single amino acids are going to be absorbed through the brush border in the small intestine, where really all of the majority of our macronutrients and micronutrients are going to be absorbed. So in terms of a little bit more background or info on amino acids themselves, we have 20 different amino acids, 9 of which are considered essential. And what this means is that we have to obtain them from our diet. We can't synthesize them. We cannot make them on our own, internally. So amino acids themselves are precursors for the production of really important non-steroidal hormones, neurotransmitters, which are chemical messengers that play a really, really vital role in a lot of different physiological functions in the body. To give you a couple specific examples, neurotransmitters like dopamine and epinephrine, which a lot of us, may have heard of before, require the amino acids. I'll butcher probably a variety of these: phenylalanine and tyrosine. And serotonin, another one many of us have maybe heard of before, which is kind of like our feel-good neurotransmitter. This neurotransmitter is actually derived from the amino acid tryptophan. Tryptophan, Abby and I were talking about before this, is a lot of us kind of think about tryptophan as like the Thanksgiving, amino acid that makes us feel kind of like, tired and full and happy.
Exactly.
So Yeah, that and tryptophan is found in turkey and a variety of other protein sources, and it's not just here to make us tired. It's actually needed to produce things like serotonin. And interestingly, non-steroidal hormones like melatonin, which is a hormone that is most well known for its role in regulating sleep and circadian rhythms, is also made from tryptophan. So melatonin comes from tryptophan. The non-essential amino acid proline is needed to produce something called glutathione, which is kind of considered the master antioxidant in the body. So it plays a huge role when it comes to kind of supporting the immune system, as well as with supporting detoxification in the liver. So it's a really important antioxidant. Other important non-steroidal hormones that are derived from amino acids include things like thyroid hormone, which is made from the amino acid tyrosine. Insulin, which is our primary blood sugar regulating hormone, is also made from amino acids. So just to give you a sense of how important these amino acids are, and each amino acid has really a different role, a different function, supports a different process in the body. So really, really crucial to make sure that we're getting all of the amino acids that the body needs, in order to kind of support these things. So basically, once we break down protein into these amino acids, we absorb these amino acids, and assuming that the body has enough glucose present for energy, amino acids are essentially rebuilt to kind of form new proteins in cells and around the body. Some of these amino acids are going to go towards fueling our muscles and supporting things like tissue repair. And some are going to be used as an energy source, kind of depending on the context in the situation. But if we are not getting enough protein, or we are not breaking it down adequately and, absorbing it optimally, we are depriving the body of the raw materials and the key resources that it needs to function optimally. So if you didn't love protein and amino acids prior to this, I hope that you do now.
I'm almost like, our amino acids queen? Like, do we like rename that? It's actually about amino acids and like proteins, like the big veil. But really, we want these nitty gritty building blocks more than we want anything else.
100%. That is the goal, is to, get all of these amino acids, these, 20 different amino acids, and to get them in ample, abundant amounts, and to actually be able to absorb and, utilize them well. And I think you're right. I think amino acids are queen.
Like, I always think about Scrabble, and like I always get stuck with like the crappiest letters in Scrabble. And like, if Scrabble was any reflection of my intake of amino acids, like I'd be pissed. Like I'd have like no structures to build anything cool. But that piece of like, amino acids are very similar to like the letters in the alphabet. Like, if you don't have, the full span of the alphabet, and certain, obviously vowels are going to be more readily or frequently utilized than maybe some others. Like, there's more value in certain amino acids than others, but like we do need them all to make all of the words. It functions very much the same.
I love this Scrabble analogy. I might steal that from you.
My Nana was a big Scrabble player. We've played a lot of Scrabble in my family. I'm still the worst, and I still don't know how to spell, so.
Well, good thing that we're functional dietitians and we don't need to be good at spelling.
Thank goodness.
So now that you know how important these amino acids are, where do amino acids come from? Protein, obviously, but what are sources of protein? Let's kind of like take it back a little bit and, talk more about that.
Yeah. So we dove into this a little bit in last week's episode. But so protein really comes from protein-rich foods. So we're going to think of things initially like our kind of chicken, turkey, beef, bison, lamb. So some of our more kind of animal muscle proteins, fish, shellfish. Then we can think about Greek yogurt, tofu, tempeh, so some of our plant-based proteins. legumes like chickpeas, beans, and lentils, which are plant protein sources. And they're also, as we mentioned last week, kind of predominant carbohydrate sources. So we're walking the line between kind of protein sources and carbohydrate sources with some of our plant proteins, which really brings us into the conversation of like, let's talk about plant proteins and animal proteins for a second. Let's talk about the elephant in the room here that most of us think about when we think about protein. So to start off, we really don't want this conversation to turn into like this versus that of like, this is better than that. But really, we do want to, from the nature of like, let's compare them and then kind of see what we come out with the other side. Really, we want you to understand the similarities and the differences between the two and kind of highlight how, really both plant and animal proteins can have a place on the plate. And we just want you to more understand how they function and really the importance of both of them. So the biggest difference between animal and plant proteins is the amount and variety of amino acids that are present in the foods. So when we eat protein to gain access to its amino acids, these amino acids are really what run the show, as Jilly kind of outlined, from our liver detox to muscle synthesis to enzymes, even for more optimal digestion, gut immune strength. It's all about the amino acids. So animal proteins are complete sources of protein, meaning they are complete with all of the essential, those 9 amino acids that we must get from foods. Whereas plant proteins are incomplete sources of amino acids, most of them, meaning they do not contain all 9 of those essential amino acids that we need from foods. So there are some exceptions like soy and quinoa, hemp and buckwheat are complete sources of plant proteins. However, all of these proteins, be it complete or incomplete, carry a different assortment and amount of those types of amino acids. So we've got different distributions, we could say, in some of these foods. And the biggest amino acids that are missing or low from plant-based foods are kind of a highlight of a couple: lysine, threonine, leucine, methionine, tryptophan. And those are pretty key amino acids that are involved in processes like muscle synthesis. Oh my gosh. All right. Muscle synthesis and neurotransmitter formation for things like our mood and our sleep and our focus. So we just have some opportunities where we think about, okay, I'm going to get, some amino acids from these, abundance from animal proteins, and I might need, to fill in a couple gaps with some of these plant-based foods here. That's just the truth of it. So the big picture is that we really want to be focusing on getting the variety of amino acids and really optimizing the food that we need to emphasize to get that most robust pool of those building blocks, rather than get into the nitty-gritty debate of animal versus plant proteins and, maybe the ethics and whatnot behind it. We're really just here to talk science to you. This brings up kind of this maybe old school idea of like protein pairing. If anybody's heard about this before, which essentially means kind of pairing 2 or more plant proteins together at a meal to make up for the missing amino acids. So an example of this would be where like beans and rice came from. But we now know that the body's able to create an amino acid pool really for roughly 24 hours, which means really over the course of the day, as long as we're focusing on a variety of different protein foods, we can create a complete pool of amino acids. So again, it's really the focus on the variety of proteins than it is on this kind of nitty-gritty, this versus that idea. So just another area that we want to kind of mention and be aware of is that kind of plant proteins are those high proportion of carbohydrates. So, in last week's episode, we really talked about those beans and legumes kind of falling more into those starchy carbohydrates and partially into the protein section. But we really look at foods as their kind of predominant macronutrient. So a lot of those legumes and beans, we might put more into, with our clients saying into that like starchy carbohydrate section, and then kind of maybe emphasize some other forms of protein on the plate, really because we are looking at the lens of blood sugar. So it's not a value of whether those foods are good or bad, but more focusing on what we are getting at with these foods and their effect on blood sugar. So when we are eating a predominantly plant-based diet with really a lot of reliance on proteins from the beans and the legumes and some other plants, we sometimes can see challenges with blood sugar regulation. And then the last piece that we want to kind of talk about in terms of just more specific plant foods is often when we have clients using like nuts and seeds as sources of protein, which, yes, they do contain protein. Again, they're kind of spanning between the predominant fat content of these foods, and they do have a small amount of protein. But we're talking like 3 to 5 grams of protein. So when we're aiming to get 30 grams of protein at a meal, that like 1 or 2 tablespoons of peanut butter certainly is going to be a contribution to our protein needs, but it's really not going to take us to the finish line of hitting that goal. So sometimes when we hear, oh, I had a smoothie this morning and it had like 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, we're kind of like, and what else?
Where's the protein?
Exactly. Yeah. And that, again, is taking us to that big picture of like blood sugar and all of those functions.
And you can really argue too that most all plant foods have some amount of protein, right? We were also talking about the fact that like, okay, greens have a little bit of protein. A lot of plant foods do have a little bit of protein, but that doesn't make them a good source of protein. And I love nut and seed butter, but to get to 30 grams of protein eating nut or seed butter, that would likely not feel very good for my digestion or anyone else's. So, we need to think about whether it is a good source of protein or if it just is contributing, a little bit of protein.
Absolutely. And that piece too of, are those nutrients in the foods like as bioavailable, meaning can we absorb them as readily? And, the bioavailability and absorption of some amino acids and nutrients in plants are lower than animal proteins. That's, again, we know this from research and measuring of the absorption of these in foods and how really plant foods are harder to break down in the digestive system. And this is where, fiber and specific nutrients kind of can get bound up in those plant-based foods. And we're going to dive into this concept a little bit more in the kind of carbohydrates episode that we're going to dive into, talking about fiber and all of that stuff. But these are all things that we want to be mindful of floating in the back of our head when we're making choices about, the foods that we're putting on our plate, especially when we're really optimizing for protein intake. So again, coming back to the big picture of variety and really where, plant and animal both have a place on the plate. And we want to think about that opportunity for kind of like amino acids pooling over the course of the day. But just to kind of do our last little comparison of the two in terms of just the volume of protein to kind of take home our point here, let's compare, let's say 4 ounces of beef to 4 ounces of kidney beans. Just straight numbers here. Beef's about 30 grams of protein versus that same 4 ounces of kidney beans is about 9 grams. So pretty big difference in terms of one hitting our macronutrient need for protein, one falling a little shy. So we'd need to add other foods. Beef provides 100% of the essential amino acids, while kidney beans are providing about 20 to 50% of those amino acids, depending upon the unique amino acid that we're looking at. So really, in order to get the same amount of protein from kidney beans as the beef, we would need to be eating 12 ounces and a cup of rice, because we need to pair some things to get all of those amino acids. So we'd be consuming, just from a numbers standpoint, like 640 calories and 122 grams of carbs just from our one meal of protein needs reliant from kidney beans and rice. So our point here, again, different foods provide different nutrients and macronutrients. And when it comes to animal proteins, we are getting more effective and efficient intake of amino acids than plant proteins. So overall, our goal is really getting the optimal amounts of protein from a variety of sources. And we really believe it's best when we partner both plant and animal proteins for gut and hormone health.
I couldn't agree more. And I love the way that you kind of call out the fact that these are just different foods. It's not, apples to apples. And, in terms of animal proteins, plant proteins, and, you can make arguments that beef doesn't have, fiber. It doesn't have, some of the, phytonutrients or phytochemicals that some of these plant proteins contain. So they're just really, really different foods at the end of the day. And I think there's like all sorts of things flying around Instagram comparing, X protein to Y protein in terms of animal versus plant. And I understand the intention behind those types of things, but I think it just makes it really, confusing for consumers because they are just very different foods. There are benefits and there are drawbacks to both. So really at the end of the day, it's about, meeting your body's amino acid needs or, kind of filling up that, amino acid pool, being able to actually break down proteins into those amino acids, absorb, utilize these things properly from a variety of sources.
And your point too of beef doesn't add fiber. It's like, well, if we, rewind to last week and we think about that gut healing kind of hormone plate that we talked about, that's why we have diversity on the plate. We've got, a section for protein, and then we have a section for starchy carbohydrates and our non-starchy vegetables, which are very fibrous and so it's not about one food having to be the end all be all mecca of every nutrient that we're going to get. Again, that variety.
Diversity.
Yeah.
What do they say? It's the essence of life. It's
exactly.
It's the totally wrong saying, but
we make up our own sayings here.
Yeah. So now that you have a little sense of where protein comes from and kind of some of the differences between animal and plant proteins, let's talk a little bit about the quality of protein. And I want to call out that, in research, when we're looking at protein and talking about quality, often this is referring to the actual bioavailability, Abby's talking about in terms of, the absorbability and your body's ability to, bring in these amino acids and meet your needs from these foods optimally. With talking about quality of protein here, really we want to speak to kind of what to look for specifically, with labels and marketing when you are purchasing and choosing protein products when you're at the grocery store. So in terms of protein, quality and sourcing, for animal products specifically, I want to kind of list out some of the things to look for in terms of the gold standard when it comes to quality. And with animal proteins in particular, we do know that there are differences in the actual nutrient content of the protein that you are consuming, depending on how the animal was raised, what it ate, as it was being raised. So this is really kind of where that's coming from, and how the animals were treated and cared for. So when it comes to poultry, so things like chicken and turkey, ideally gold standard, we want to look for poultry that is organic and pasture raised. For our grazing animals, so things like beef, bison, lamb, ideally looking for products that are organic, grass-fed, and ideally grass-finished. Again, and this speaks to, the quality of the animal's life, but also the nutrient content of the, protein that you are consuming. Animals raised, that are grass-fed, grass-finished, they are have been found to contain higher amounts of beneficial fatty acids, so more omega-3 fatty acids, less inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids. They're more rich in CLA or conjugated linoleic acid, and they also just contain a lot more vitamins compared to grain-fed animals, which makes sense when you think about it at the end of the day, right? So there's just some differences here. With eggs, ideally we want to look for eggs that are organic and pasture raised. With dairy, organic and grass-fed. Again, this is going to impact the nutrient content of the dairy. When it comes to fish, the gold standard would be looking for fish that is wild caught and sustainably harvested. When it comes to soy and soy products specifically, so speaking to some plant proteins, ideally we want to look for organic soy. So things like organic tofu or organic tempeh. Soy is a high pesticide GMO crop. And with choosing organic, if you have access to that, you're going to minimize your exposure to these things. And I will say that, again, this is the gold standard. And if this is not in your budget, we want to totally call out and recognize that it it does cost more to purchase these higher quality proteins. We wish that we could make these accessible to absolutely everyone, but know that if this is not in the budget for you right now, that is okay. If you have the ability to, you have access to, and your finances permit, choose organic. Maybe you can't get the pasture raised or grass fed, grass finished, but choose organic where you can. And if that's not an option for you, maybe just consider choosing leaner cuts of meat. Meats that are a little bit less fatty, where some of these toxins and different things accumulate. Another option, if you are looking to kind of bring in more higher quality animal products that are a bit more affordable than what we're seeing at like a Whole Foods, I always like to kind of look for what's around a client. So what's local? Do you have any farms that offer a CSA that you could buy into and, get regular deliveries of really, great quality animal products? If you are in Massachusetts, the Boston area, Abby and I are fans of Walden, which sources really high quality animal products from around New England and I think New York as well. There's also great quality animal products even on Thrive Market. If anyone's familiar with that platform, they do have proteins that you can order, animal proteins. Another company we like is Force of Nature, which is a really great company. The brother or sister company is Paleo Valley, which we also love. And Force of Nature is doing some really cool things to try to make really high quality animal products accessible to the masses and with supporting regenerative farming. So that's super cool. And for fish, there's also kind of these different delivery services or options that can make, the wild caught sustainably harvested fish a bit more accessible. A couple that I recommend often are Catch Sitka and Sizzlefish. So more affordable, everything comes frozen. And you just, throw it in the freezer. And to speak to what clients have said too from using these services, the quality in terms of like the taste and freshness is like massive compared to, some of the things that we access at the grocery store. And it's, a bit more affordable. If that's not in the cards for you, but we're really looking to amp up the quality fish intake, Wild Planet is a great company that's found at a lot of grocery stores, and they make the canned and pouched tuna, salmon, sardines, which is a very accessible, also low effort, but accessible financially, kind of way to bring in more of this fatty fish. So just a couple kind of thoughts on how to make this work, but we really want to drive home the fact that, if it's not in your budget, that's okay. But if it is, this is something that, we feel strongly is worth, investing in and maybe putting some resources into, in terms of bringing in those quality proteins. Do you have any other thoughts on, options or protein quality, Ab?
I think, just to even that point of what your food ate is what then you eat. Always like an interesting concept of, how do we get nutrition? We eat it. How do they get nutrition? And then how do we eat nutrient dense products is like through what they eat. Even and pasture raised is a defined term. It actually legally means that this animal had to get outside. And when we think about, the egg aisle, could there be more words that they use to kind of describe, and very confusing. And that pasture raised means that bird was able to get outside and eat the bugs and the worms and the, whatever other things they're going to eat, which are very random in kind of type. But those are how they're getting those omega-3 fatty acids. Those are how they're getting. So we don't actually want vegetarian fed eggs. It's you'll see it on labels. I always laugh that I'm God, this is so confusing to someone who's not, educated. There's 30 different labels here and they make them look very shiny.
Oh my gosh, it's so much marketing. It's really confusing and deceiving. And, some of these terms are not regulated, so people can kind of throw them around or companies can throw them around and it sounds, enticing. And we trust that, our food companies are giving us good products, but there is a lot of confusion and a lot of deceitful marketing, unfortunately. But I love that you brought up that point, Abby, in terms of some of the kind of trigger words that I mentioned with the gold standard of pasture raised or grass fed, grass finished, organic. These do have certain requirements in terms of, the grazing and, being able to get or engage in the natural foraging practices, not, being in crates or crowded, living spaces. So all of these things are important. We could definitely go down a big rabbit hole here in terms of, talking about, the conventional, farming and that whole industry. But I think just giving you a little bit of information about what to look for, is a good starting point, so you can tune out some of the noise and deceitful marketing.
Yeah. And I think just, on that point of like the ethics of, if we choose higher quality, especially in farms like, Force of Nature and the regenerative farming, like that is really like what our planet is what is going to help with the, health of our soils and the health of our planet. This like mono agriculture that we've created is really what is kind of devastating the nutrient levels of our soils and the overuse of pesticides and all of these things. So it's like ultimately, we get to vote with our dollars. And that's, where, I think there's a very, there's another side to it. And that's like, Sustainable Dish. Diana, I think is her name, is really does a beautiful job in kind of showing this side of it. And we'll probably have a whole episode on this coming up because I could say a lot more, but I'm going to hold myself.
And she has a book and a documentary, Sacred Cow. Great resource if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this stuff. And also, I just want to point out one mistake I made. I was mentioning Force of Nature, which is an incredible company as well. But I was meant to say Wild Pastures for the kind of, being a more nationwide, CSA and the regenerative farming and all of that as a correction.
Very cool.
So let's talk about protein powders. Protein powders. Oh my gosh. So we get so many questions about protein powders from clients on social media, and there is a ton of confusion and controversy out there about protein powders. Protein powders are typically used most often by athletes, by health and wellness enthusiasts, and individuals that are maybe looking to up their protein intake in an easy way to support, building lean muscle. So there's a variety of people that might have an interest in protein powders, and they're definitely, trendy. So the one thing that we need to point out right off the bat when it comes to protein powders is that protein powders are not regulated by the FDA. So there are many protein powder products out there that can contain a lot of additives and fillers. So things like gums, thickeners, non-nutritive sweeteners, sugar alcohols, natural flavors, and all sorts of things. And I point this out because I think a lot of us assume or think about protein powder like it's a health food, right? And really, at the end of the day, it's a processed food, which means we do want to be mindful of the sourcing, the processing, and the other ingredients that are added to the protein powder. These things matter. And it's, I'll talk in a minute about kind of what to look for there. But I just, want to call that out because not all protein powders are created equal, and we can have some, not so great ultra processed, protein powders that have like a laundry list of 30 ingredients in there. So something we just want to be aware of. In terms of types of protein powders, we have our animal-based protein and we have our plant-based protein sources. So for animal-based protein powders, most commonly, these are going to come from dairy. So our whey protein or casein or a combination of both. And I would say that whey and casein are probably the most well-researched or well-studied types of protein powder. So we have a lot of data on them. They've been around for a long time. We also have egg-based protein powders, which have become a little bit more popular over the years. And then we also have things like our collagen peptides, which are also very popular right now. For plant-based protein powders, the most common or popular choices are typically going to be things like soy, hemp, and pea proteins, because these are complete plant proteins. All other plant based protein powders are usually going to have some combination of protein sources since they are incomplete proteins. So you'll see like the soy protein, hemp protein, pea proteins as standalone proteins in a protein powder that's plant-based. But if you're seeing things like brown rice, protein, pumpkin seed derived protein powder, even like chia seed, you'll see in some. With these incomplete proteins, we need to combine a variety of them in order to provide that complete amino acid profile, since they are, lacking some key amino acids there. We know that with whole food protein sources, animal proteins are considered higher quality because of the quantity and the absorbability of the amino acids, like we've talked about. But protein powders, in kind of comparing things, are a little bit different. So in studies that have compared supplementation with whey protein and pea protein powder, for example, research has found that there are actually no big differences in the type of protein powder used when there's been, comparative studies. When looking at improvements with things like strength measures, body composition, muscle thickness, various measures of recovery. So there really aren't big differences in research between these things. And this is because when you are making protein powder from something like peas, you are isolating the protein component and you are removing the starches, carbohydrates, fiber, and you are essentially creating this like ultra concentrated source of protein, which is why studies on animal versus plant protein powders are so comparable with the studies that we do have. There are definitely still some differences with the specifics of the amino acid profile with these things if you were to compare like a whey protein isolate and a pea protein isolate. But ultimately, it appears as though, some of these outcomes that have been measured in various studies, things are pretty comparable. But in terms of the translation to real food, like Abby was kind of describing, if you were trying to get 30 grams of protein from beef or milk, if we're thinking like the whey and casein comparison, versus 30 grams of protein from something like peas, I don't even know how many cups of peas you'd need to eat to get there, but it would be a lot. So it's really just, it's not the same in terms of, food-based sources versus, protein powders and protein isolates. So just to give you the highlights on some of the differences between plant-based and animal-based protein powder specifically. At the end of the day, if I'm recommending a protein powder to clients, I typically will default to them in terms of their preference for animal or plant-based protein powder. And ideally, this is something that we're just using to supplement. It is not the predominant main protein source in our diet. It is something that is supplemental. Some individuals do better with animal-based protein powders and others do better with plant-based protein powders. Oftentimes, this does boil down to what's going on in the gut, surprise, surprise, in terms of, what someone tolerates, what someone feels good with, reactivity and all of that. When choosing a protein powder product in general, we want to choose protein powders that are made with very, very few ingredients. The less, the better. And ideally, we want very minimal additives. Again, there are some protein powders out there that you will see have like 30 ingredients. So, I'm thinking we're looking for, 3, 4, 5 maybe at the most ingredient wise, but less is definitely more when it comes to these protein powders. Ideally, we want a protein powder that was made without chemical solvents. So chemical solvents like hexane are often used as part of the protein extraction process with both animal and plant proteins. So we want to not be kind of messing with our food as much as we are, because, this can, lead to other issues and more, kind of reactivity and things like that. So ideally, it's going to be made without chemical solvents. And lastly, we always want to make sure that the protein powder has been independently third-party tested. So that company is paying an outside company to actually, review and test the product, specifically for things like contaminants, heavy metals. Heavy metals are more so a concern with the plant-based proteins. And more so as well with the combination like blends of plant proteins, because there's more opportunity for, contaminants and heavy metals to come in. So we really want to make sure that, the protein powder we're selecting pays for that independent third-party testing, and that they share that information or they share that certificate of analysis. Sometimes you can get it on the website. If you can't, reach out and ask them. If they won't provide it, to you, then we move on. That is a red flag. So ultimately, the goal is to ideally really get most of our protein from whole food sources, both animal and plant, and to focus on diversity with, those sources. So we're getting a variety of amino acids from foods. Protein powders can absolutely be a great way to supplement, to fill in the gaps. But at the end of the day, they really should not be, unless there's, a medical reason that that's happening, they should not be replacing our protein source in more than like one meal, or a snack daily. We want to get protein from other sources for the amino acids, but also for all of the other great nutrients that we get with the whole food sources.
I couldn't agree more of that kind of like once a day max. And then we, that variety, we want other different sources of proteins and different foods to come in. Should we share our like current favorite proteins that I guess we're using and maybe recommending?
Oh yeah, I love that idea. Give some shout outs to companies that are doing it right.
Yeah.
I would say my go-to kind of recommendations based on quality and also what clients actually like and enjoy from a taste perspective. Usually my go-to for a plant protein recommendation is going to be something like Nuzest, and particularly their GI line, which contains very few ingredients, and removes some additional, kind of additives that can be irritating for people with a sensitive gut. But I just kind of like to keep it clean across the board. For an animal protein, I'm a huge fan of Paleo Valley, and all of their protein powder products.
I love that. Nuzest is totally my go-to recommendation for like a plant-based protein. Also, I actually didn't even know they had a GI line, so I'm excited about that little nugget of wisdom.
So good.
And then I'm a big fan. I love the Paleo Valley too. I'm hooked on right now Be Well by Kelly's collagen protein. I predominantly use the unflavored, which is like kind of sweet on its own right. But I do have like a love affair with her chocolate, and literally just adding hot water to it to making like a hot cocoa. It is so good.
That sounds delicious.
And it's a collagen based. I don't think I said that. So, I think this kind of takes us to our next topic of, let's talk about protein and stress. And what might be surprising is that we can actually use protein for energy. Jilly kind of mentioned that at the beginning of the talk on kind of protein metabolism. But it really only becomes available to us as a predominant energy source in the face of chronic or prolonged stress. And knowing what we know about chronic stress, this isn't a process that we want to activate often. So this process of turning protein, or more specifically, our valuable amino acids, into energy, or really into blood sugar for energy, is called gluconeogenesis. And it's activated in times of high stress or starvation, prolonged fasting, anytime that we're having low energy reserves in the body, so a low caloric state. This is how stress can lead to the breakdown of our protein stores, such as our muscles and our gut lining, to highlight two of our very, very valuable protein areas in the body, protein pools. And this actually can lead to elevated blood sugar. So it can be surprising when we think about elevated blood sugar, but we haven't eaten anything. Where is it coming from? It could be coming from the metabolism of our own protein stores. So just really quick and dirty to do another little deep dive kind of chemistry moment on gluconeogenesis. So in the face of chronic stress or low energy intake or fasting, especially prolonged fasting, the body sounds the alarm that energy availability is too low. And thus we need to adjust our metabolic functions to free up energy or glucose from other sources. So our nervous system and our HPA, so our hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, are upregulated when our stress balance, or allostatic load, another way to say kind of stress balance, in the body become high or too high. So this leads to kind of the upregulation of the nervous system and activates our like that go, 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 that fight or flight nervous system. And our HPA axis triggers the release of cortisol, our glucocorticoid stress hormone. And cortisol acts as a catabolic hormone, meaning it breaks down tissues in the body to free up resources for energy. If we were running from a tiger, this would be a very helpful time to get some extra energy to get to a safe place. But if we are sitting, writing an email and stressing out, we probably don't want free energy and elevated blood glucose because we're not going to have anywhere to utilize it. So this is really how, when we are experiencing a low energy state of prolonged fasting, too low calorie diets, or excessive physical exercise that's over our caloric intake, our body's metabolism will protectively shift with the guide of cortisol to start to break down tissues like muscle and our gut lining and freeing up those amino acids to produce blood sugar. So what might be the most surprising is that this stress shift can actually increase the potential for actually insulin resistance and those elevated blood sugar episodes. So this really speaks to the importance of nourishing our bodies for calories as the foundation, and then focusing on that optimal macronutrient intake. As you know, we don't want to threaten those energy needs of our bodies because we have brilliant mechanism that, you know, our body will find the resources that it needs. It is absolutely a brilliant organism, and we are put together in very specific ways, but often kind of at the expense of, you know, some hard-earned muscle and gut lining is when we're practicing things like very low protein intake, very low calorie intake, or ultra low carbohydrate intake. These can be some of the things that can trigger those protective metabolic shifts. So this highlights the loss of muscle mass in weight loss. So we can often hear from, you know, prospective clients of, you know, the only way I can lose weight is by restricting calories or macronutrients. I'm using air quotes there. And we hear that often. And you know, really the question that we start to think of is, when we are restricting to that level, are we actually losing more or mostly muscle mass? Especially if it's done in this extreme fashion or over a very short period of time. When weight loss is really just measured by a scale, it's really just that one-sided number that doesn't tell us what type of tissue mass we're losing. And our body, when again in that threatened state, will typically shift to metabolizing maybe even more muscle mass than adipose. And generally, any weight loss, we're going to be losing both adipose tissue and muscle mass. But the more gradual and supportive we aim around the changes in body composition, if we're seeking weight loss, we might see more of a kind of reserve of muscle mass and more utilization of that fat mass. And we really talked about that in our weight loss episode, especially those adaptive protective mechanisms that make it so that we don't want to go anywhere fast in terms of changing metabolic function in the body. We like the slow and steady tortoise.
Low and slow wins the race. And it's, I love, you know, kind of how you break all this down. And I think specifically in talking about, you know, body composition and weight loss, because you know, like we talked about in the weight loss episode, we very much acknowledge and respect the desire for people to want to see those shifts. But a lot of what we actually see in practice is individuals working against their bodies. And, you know, maybe it's that like protein intake is super low and we can't even, you know, kind of build and, you know, repair and maintain that lean muscle. Or maybe we're just so focused on protein and we forget about that preferential energy source, glucose, and the body is going to continue to, you know, resist building that lean muscle. So, you know, just by adjusting, you know, macronutrient intake and kind of working towards meeting your needs optimally, you know, this can really lead to not just benefits with, you know, body composition or aesthetic goals, but just like overall health goals. And that's why we really love the balanced plate, the gut and hormone plate so much, because it really serves as a starting point for bringing in all of these elements that the body needs to function optimally. And absolutely, you can kind of fine tune and tweak and customize from there. But most individuals are really just going to benefit from like consistency with meal composition using that plate as a guide.
And I mean, like we've been doing this for what, like 15, you know, arguably 20 years since we became obsessed with nutrition. Like I still think about the Balanced Plate as my tool to put together my meals. It's not like I've graduated to this like secret level, where like we actually were like, actually, this is what we really do. But like, we're just like giving you guys like the dumbed down version. Like, no, it's like, it really is just this beautiful, simplistic visual tool that has, a wealth of knowledge behind it, which we're sharing with you the why. But, that's like so much of the action is that.
I completely agree. And it's like, it almost sounds too simple, right? Or like too good to be true. But it's so wildly impactful. And, when you're thinking about that visual tool consistently, it starts to become really intuitive. And again, you can fine tune and tweak and get more micro with meeting your needs, but most people are not there yet, honestly, in our experience. And I think that fundamental plate is just such a great tool. So how much protein do we actually need in terms of getting into, kind of the nitty gritty here? So the RDA guidelines for protein intake for the average adult is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. This is the bare minimum recommendation for protein intake for preventing illness. But most of us are not just looking to survive or to prevent disease. We are looking to thrive. So this recommendation for protein intake, that RDA recommendation, is actually really, really low based on up-to-date research. And the average adult actually needs a lot more protein than that to function optimally and to actually thrive. So optimal protein intake is going to, and kind of what your needs are specifically, are going to vary greatly, depending on things like, are you a male or a female, your age or how old you are, how physically active you are. So there's a lot of factors that come into play when you're actually determining an individual's needs on this more micro level. But in general, as kind of a benchmark, optimal protein intake based on up-to-date research is more like 0.8 to 1 or even 1.2 grams of protein per pound body weight. If you're an athlete, you're an older adult, protein requirements actually might even be higher than this. But that guideline is a really, really great starting point for getting, just a sense of where you're at, how much you're eating, what you're maybe wanting to work towards. And if you're doing that calculation right now and you're like, holy crap, that is a ton of protein, I am nowhere near there. Don't stress. Start from where you are at today, and just slowly, incrementally increase your protein intake over time and play around with things a little bit. Get a sense of what feels best, what works best for you. As another sort of general guideline or benchmark, I would say most adult women, and again, if you're highly active or there's other factors, this could be much different. But most adult women are going to notice really big improvements if they're getting at least 100 grams of protein a day. Maybe your needs are, 120 or 140, but if you can nail that 100 grams of protein, consistently, you will probably notice massive shifts with how you are feeling, with blood sugar regulation, all the things that, we've kind of talked about. And if you're also freaking out, like, how the heck am I going to eat that much protein? Let's kind of talk practical application tips for, how to do this in real life. First and foremost, start from where you're at and maybe just start increasing the actual portion of protein that you are eating at a meal. It could be that simple in terms of maybe you're having like a little itty bitty, piece of, chicken or beef or fish at a meal. Maybe you're having 2 eggs for breakfast every day. Clients are always so shocked when I let them know that 2 eggs is not nearly enough of protein to meet an adult woman's needs. So, an egg, depending on the size, is going to have like 6 or 7 grams of protein. So if we're having 2 eggs, we're not getting a ton of protein, anywhere from, 12 to maybe 15 grams. So throw another egg in there. Maybe get crazy and throw 2 eggs in there. Or if that feels like, too much, maybe you do a couple eggs and you add some smoked salmon on the side, or, some chicken sausage or ground beef or turkey as a way to kind of amp up the protein intake a little bit at, breakfast. You can also kind of get a little bit like sneaky or, bring in some of our go-to tips for getting in protein a little bit more easily in a way that doesn't feel like you're just increasing the straight portion of protein. So a couple examples here would be like cooking your grains in bone broth, or adding bone broth to things like soups and stews, which is actually a pretty rich source of protein and great key amino acids. If you are someone that eats like oatmeal for breakfast, as an example, maybe this is where you add your quality protein powder in. Or you could just whisk some eggs directly into your oats after cooking, which if you haven't tried that before, it sounds a little bit weird and creepy, but you don't taste it and it makes your oats like super fluffy. Have you tried that before?
It's like so good. And then, or so even good. Like cook your oats in bone broth and go like the savory breakfast way. And then add like, you could add like whole eggs into that. So it's like you're kind of taking like a whole new approach on oatmeal that became like savory.
I love that. Savory oatmeal. I'm a savory breakfast gal through and through. That sounds lovely. And some other, kind of tips would be maybe choosing protein-rich starches to use as your carbohydrate. So that could be things like peas or quinoa, legumes, or maybe using legume-based pastas, which we mentioned in the last episode, like your lentil pasta or chickpea-based pasta, which can really amp up the protein intake in a way that feels a little bit more subtle. Also adding things like pumpkin seeds, hemp seeds to snacks, to salads as like a crunchy munchy topping can be an easy way to kind of amp things up. A fourth a cup of pumpkin seeds has like 7 or 8 grams of protein, which is pretty good. Yeah. So just a few ideas there. Do you have any other tips and tricks for sneaking in protein?
Well, I think this is where it's like speaking to like some of our plant-based proteins and like welcoming them into meals that involve animal proteins. Like just like that example of like a lentil pasta with like bolognese sauce. You're like, whoa, we just like massively increased the protein of that meal. So it's not like, they play well together. Even like in our, oatmeal example, it's like adding in like hemp hearts are a favorite protein and healthy fat. And like mineral rich source of, lots of different nutrients and things. But I think it's like 3 tablespoons, which is kind of a lot of hemp hearts, but 3 tablespoons is like 10 grams of protein. Realistically, probably it's like 2 tablespoons, what most people eat. But similar to like the pumpkin seeds, like kind of sprinkling them in. They don't change the consistency or the flavor terrifically, but they add like a little bit of texture. Crunchy munchy is now what I'm going to say forever.
Crunchy munchy. Another great crunchy munchy, which I think you love too, Abby, is like roasting chickpeas, seasoning them so they're crunchy and kind of almost crouton-like, and throw them on a salad. And you can also have, some, fish on there, maybe some, pouched or canned salmon or, whatever proteins left over from dinner. And you throw in some crunchy munchy roasted chickpeas, and you're really kind of amping up the protein and the fiber there.
Yeah. I those are so good. And you could, they sell them in like pretty, in like pouches now too. Sometimes they're like so crunchy and you're like, did I lose a tooth? But you can find goods like Vienna or something like that. But even thinking of like, can I, if I'm in a pinch, it's like, can I take like a canned, like one of like the Amy's like butternut squash soups or something. And then maybe I have some like leftover like grilled chicken and I'll dice that up. And then let me add some, of those like chickpeas on top of the soup. And I've like doctored up. I like refer to this with clients of like, let's doctor it up. It's like you took something store-bought, or I did something on Instagram the other day where, did you ever watch that show like Semi-Homemade? With like Sandra
No, but
Lee
I saw
you
post about that, and I'm like sad that I never saw that. It sounds
she
awesome.
Was actually, if anyone watched it, she was a character. She like always had like a signature cocktail, but it felt like she had like 2 or 3 before the actual show was aired. And I was like, this is my kind of lady. But it's always like kind of that like semi-homemade. It's like, all right, I've got like this like can of soup, but like how do I bump up the protein and like the nutrient density? And it's like, thinking of like, are there leftovers that I can put in there? Are there like some other additions that I can like kind of bring things together? We've talked about this, like some of our most favorite meals come from like, what do I have left in the kitchen that's like random? You're like, scraping the pantries and like back of the fridge type of things. Sometimes they're weird and I won't ever speak about the combinations of food I eat. And other times I'm like, I'm a genius.
This is the best combination ever. I will actually say Abby is a genius at like I have nothing in my house and I'm going to whip up something that tastes absolutely delicious.
I take that.
And it usually involves a lentil pasta, which I will never turn down.
It always involves lentil pasta. And like a tinned fish.
Which, I mean, so convenient, right? And in terms of like accessibility and pantry staples.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully this is helpful for highlighting the fact that it doesn't have to be like crazy hard, and it doesn't, necessarily have to mean like just eating a large piece of animal protein. We've talked about the benefits of animal protein, but you can really get meet your protein needs optimally and all of your, kind of micronutrient needs if you're kind of bringing in all these different sources and have a little fun with it.
Fun is the name of the game. And, starting now with really focusing on like protein, and we say now, like, we were actually looking at like, what is our like average audience age and things. And like most of us it's like spans from like 20 to like mid 40s, I'd say, if we're being, kind of the tail ends. And welcome if you're younger or older. We like, what? We want everyone. But that idea of like, where we are, now is where we're starting from. So, if you are, on the kind of earlier side of like aging, it's like we want to think about like, how do we support kind of like aging more gracefully in our bodies? And that has nothing to do with like aesthetics. I mean, if that's a goal, we're all going the same place with what we're talking about. But really about like our, ability to participate in our lives through, all the decades of our lives is really the ultimate goal, and to be, present and fully involved in it. And that's really where like protein intake is no exception, as protein intake is directly correlated with the maintenance of muscle mass as we age. So sarcopenia is a term that refers to the age-related involuntary loss of skeletal muscle mass that puts older individuals at risk of falls, fractures, and overall increased risk of death. So that process actually starts as young as the 40s. And, aging doesn't have to mean frailty. Aging doesn't have to mean like loss of muscle mass. It's a gradual process that, we do see happen. But we have, control over many of the measurable pieces of it. So there's definitely certain risk factors, such as like smoking and diabetes and certain medications and elevated body weight for starters. But even more notably is suboptimal protein intake and low nutrient density in the diet. Those show significant impact on the overall rate and amount of muscle loss. And we know that improving nutrition and lifestyle at really any age is effective for both the prevention and the treatment of sarcopenia. And protein is the major macronutrient that we know from research that reduces and even pulls us back from muscle loss even after it started to happen. So, in general, protein needs actually increase as we age. And I think that this is like not talked about enough. And I think it would be even surprising maybe for certainly like, I don't, when I think of like my mom or something, like, I'm not sure if she like overtly knows that as much as I've told her that. I'm not sure if she's hearing me. I'm like, Mom. But often in our older clients or our parents, we might see like an overall less intake of food, period. And especially a less protein intake. And we know that protein intake is associated with that increased muscle mass and even greater benefits to strength when, done alone or in combination with exercise and strength training. So, our goal is really to create these habits of consistency that include incorporating protein at all meals and snacks so that as we age, there's less likelihood of that significant muscle wasting because we're already tending to our body's protein needs. We're already building on that knowledge, those habits, those consistencies, and we're, aware of the increases that happen. Because we also have, just natural shifts of aging that are happening that involve, hormonal shifts with estrogen during perimenopause and postmenopause that lead to the body's kind of holding on to more adipose tissue and kind of resistance in building of muscle mass. And so really helping to, from the nutrition side, eat in alignment with helping to balance our blood sugar. That's going to help to balance more protein or hormonal shifts and really help to optimize the body's utilization of muscles for strength building. And we also have a natural shift in reduction of stomach acid. And as Jilly talked about at the beginning of the episode, stomach acid is incredibly important for the digestion and kind of absorption of those proteins and amino acids. So, by the age of 65, there's an approximate 30% reduction in stomach acid. So, we do have things that are naturally happening in the aging process that, pose some opportunities. But now that we know about them and we know that protein is a big, area where we can overcome some of those opportunities, that's where we can additionally focus on.
100%. And I think that it is that kind of double whammy situation with aging where protein needs increase. And with that, 30%, decline in stomach acid after age 65, it's harder to digest. And oftentimes, like we talked about in our Balanced Plate episode, when stomach acid production is low, oftentimes we will feel averse to protein foods. And when we eat protein foods, even if it's an optimal amount or a suboptimal amount, if stomach acid is low, it can kind of feel like it's sitting like a rock in our stomach, and we're actually physically feeling the effects of not being able to break that down well. So a tip that Abby had shared on the last episode, if this is relevant for you, is, maybe playing with or tinkering around with a little bit of support for encouraging digestive secretions and specifically stomach acid. So like playing around with utilizing a little bit of apple cider vinegar or lemon before meals, or maybe some actual digestive bitters, about 15 minutes before eating, maybe some ginger to really get that digestive fire going and to increase the production of stomach acid. And that alone can often make a massive difference with an individual's ability to consume appropriate amounts of protein and to break it down and, utilize those amino acids. So just a lot of opportunity with aging to, really thrive, throughout that process. And it's funny you mention your mom and the protein. Every time I talk to my mom about something related to nutrition or diet or breakfast, I'm like, how many eggs did you eat? More than 2, right? Or, did you have a full cup of cottage cheese? I'm like on her butt all the time. If you're listening to this, Mom, I'm sorry, but it's because I love you. And, we want to support that lean muscle for the healthy aging process.
And when did it become set in a law that we can only eat 2 eggs? I feel like it's anytime, sometimes clients are like, but I can't eat more than 2 eggs. I'm like, says who? Who made that rule? What?
Bring in 2 more. Yeah, totally, 2 more.
Yeah.
Bring 4. We're breaking all the rules.
No rules.
Oh my gosh. So one of the kind of last things I want to touch on about actual protein intake and kind of meeting your needs is protein timing. So just briefly, protein timing does matter. If you are not eating much protein at breakfast, or there's, some meals throughout the day that are skimpy, in protein, this can actually have a significant impact on things, and specifically, the supporting of lean muscle, like Abby is just talking about. So, we don't want to eat a bunch of low protein meals and then eat all of our protein at one time. It's not going to produce the benefit that we are looking for, even if you're getting the overall quantity that you're looking for, if it's, just at one time of day. So, research has really found in general that spreading protein intake out evenly throughout the day, and kind of giving your body that continual supply of those amino acids to utilize for all these different things in the body is where we are going to find the most benefit. I do think in particular, we both find that people really struggle with protein at breakfast. And that time in particular, we do have some good data on the importance of really nailing that protein intake first thing in the morning. When we can meet our protein needs first thing in the morning at that breakfast that we have, 1 to 2 hours after waking, we are supporting blood sugar stability for the rest of the day. We are really significantly supporting the metabolism and metabolic function. So we're setting ourselves up for success in a variety of ways, and the body is super primed and prepped for food, carbs, protein, fat, all the things in the morning in particular. So if you are kind of wondering, all right, where do I start with all of this? Check out what's happening with breakfast. There likely might be an opportunity to really amp up that protein at breakfast, which can have a really positive ripple effect on things. But in general, let's spread our protein intake out evenly. So adequate protein at every meal, and ideally bringing in some protein at snacks as well.
Protein at breakfast is like the longest conversation that I have with clients. And usually I'm like, your lunch looks great and your dinner looks great, because those are like traditional like protein. It's like, let's go non-traditional. If it's like, because a lot of our traditional, like our cereal and our pancakes or, whatever, those types of things, like, or even just the 1 to 2 eggs, like very low. So I think the most opportunity I always see is really distribution throughout the day.
100% agree.
And then in closing, what are some signs that you might experience in your own body that might be telling you you're not getting enough protein, or maybe you're not absorbing enough protein? So from kind of highlight a couple digestion symptoms, we can think of feeling early satiety. So you eat maybe a small bit of food and you're like really full well before, anyone else around you eating that same volume of food or a much larger volume of food is comfortably full. Food sitting like a rock in your stomach, feeling like it's like just not moving, or you're full, like prolonged fullness. You're full very far after a 3 to 4 hour window. That's kind of, the ideal of like starting to get hungry again for like lunch. It's like you go well past lunch and you're not even hungry, for dinner. Burping, heartburn, pressure in the upper GI or even throat, some like non-traditional kind of heartburn like symptoms can come up. Difficulty feeling full. You just feel like you could just kind of endlessly eat, or you don't really have like connection to kind of more satiety like feelings. Can be an opportunity for more protein. Overall, maybe just difficulty building lean muscle mass, opportunity for more protein and distribution of protein too. Blood sugar swings or imbalances in blood sugar, and we could experience those as kind of energy crashes, or feeling kind of like even like lightheaded, or feeling unfocused, or feeling really lethargic, and kind of just almost like highs and lows throughout the day. Hair loss or hair thinning. If we're getting sick often, that importance of kind of protein for immune function, and just overall like poor metabolic health. So we're kind of talking about our blood sugar, we're talking about cholesterol, we're talking about kind of the whole gamut of things that are to do even with body composition too. So those are just some kind of quick and dirty signs. Anything that you would add to that list?
You covered it really well. The one other thing that came to mind was anxiety and other mood disorders, in terms of, maybe it's the blood sugar instability with not eating enough protein, or maybe it is the actual lack of important amino acids that are needed, or maybe the micronutrients in, certain protein foods. So anxiety and, depression and other mood disorders, kind of making sure we're meeting our protein needs and not overlooking something that could potentially make a difference in how we're feeling.
Well, that is a wrap on our protein episode for what we have for you now. We did hold ourselves back from going on and on and on and on. But, let us know like questions, areas you want us to dig into more, things that you still want to learn more about. This is what, lights us up, and give us feedback. You can catch us on Instagram at Your Body Has Your Back. We take, any type of kind of insight of things that you want to learn there. And we can't wait to hear from you all about, how this episode's helping you, maybe even pictures of your meals. Tag us for ways that you're increasing your protein at breakfast. If you're eating 3 to 4 eggs, like holy moly.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait. And we will see you in our next episode, where we will be doing a deep dive on all things carbohydrates.